Joining us now to unpack the impact of Eskom's problems with supplying power to businesses is Chris Yelland, MD of EE Publishers. Chris, this has been an ongoing thing from Thursday all over the weekend. It's raining. I don't know, was it raining when you came in?
No, but it looks very ominous.
Very ominous. So are we likely to see Eskom revising that decision to say, listen, we might have to roll out load shedding again?
Well, look, things have eased over the weekend, which is to be expected. Load is much lower over the weekend, so this is a time for Eskom to get a bit of breathing space, fill up those bunkers with coal and get things going again after hopefully drying out the coal, hopefully not with hair dryers or anything like that. But unfortunately, the underlying problems still remain. And the underlying problems really are we have a serious capacity problem, number one. Number two, Medupi power station is running 3 years late. Number three, we have an unhealthy overdependence on a monopoly, Eskom, for our electricity supply. We also have an unhealthy overdependence on coal as an energy source. We need to diversify, manage our risks, diversify away from Eskom, diversify away from coal. And in this way, we can hopefully in the longer term get things back on track.
One thing you haven't mentioned yet, Chris, and I know it's a long list, and I know you'd get there if we had time, is the chief executive leaving at the end of the month, Brian Dames, and he apparently came back to South Africa because of the load shedding, cut short an overseas trip, which also tells you it surprised them. It always worries me that, you know, it rains in January and February. Why should they be surprised if the coal gets wet? But here he explained how South Africa got the power situation it's currently in, which we know, but he refers to it here.
It's very important that we all work together as to the situation that we're in. The situation that we're in is that we as a country decided not to invest. We'll then do that later. So 10 years after we've decided not to invest, 10 years later you had 2008, and it's going to take another few years to deal with this. If you would step back and said, if you've made the decision to build Medupi in 1998, by now it should have been done. And really that's the difference. That is the difference. So really when you have Medupi completed, not just the first unit, you really need to get to the end where it's completed. You start addressing the decision that you've made in 1998. And so the electricity system globally is a long-term business. That means you make the decisions on time, you make the necessary investments, and make sure that you create stability. We have worked very hard to make sure that the light stays on. I think we've been very successful. Compared to many other countries, we have been very successful.
Well, that's the outgoing Eskom CEO, Brian Dames, got Mindar, as they used to say in the army. He finishes at the end of the month. Effectively, what he's saying is, guys, not my fault. They should have built Medupi 10 years earlier than they are trying to do now, or at least have started on it. Chris, what you've said and what he said, we need to say these things, but on the other hand, they're not surprises. It's not like we've suddenly realized an overdependence on coal, or suddenly realized that our capacity and our leggy issue. Don't we need to handle this now differently? Say, guys, we're in a mess. We're going to have load shedding, we're going to communicate better, and we're going to tell you when we're going to switch the lights off so you can plan, instead of pretending that they're not going to.
Yeah, I think we do need to relook at the whole way we're tackling this. There are underlying structural issues that have been there for years. The trouble is there's a whole lot of ideological baggage in the way of really dealing with this matter as it should be dealt with. We have a government comprising three different organizations that have three different outlooks on the problem, and they pull in three different directions, and the result is that the status quo remains. And it has remained like this for many years. Yeah. So we need, I believe, to break this impasse, look at things differently. We need to get into the modern world. The way we're operating is really in the dark ages, figuratively and literally.
Admit that things are bad instead of pretending that they're good, Ian.
Absolutely. You know, at the moment, just going on from what Chris was saying, Eskom is risking hobbling the SA economy. It can't go ahead with, you know, one leg and both arms tied behind its back. Effectively, that is a fighting situation you're putting them in. There's only one obvious answer. They need reinforcements. How are they going to get that? They seem unable to do that themselves, running, I think you said, 10 years late. This is unacceptable. Ask the private sector, and let's see if they can come up with some ideas which could contribute, not to take Eskom out of the picture, but to add to it. And this is the ideal case for a private-public sector partnership.
We have elections coming up, and obviously this whole Eskom thing is doing its best to now try to make the household people very angry. How's this affecting business? I mean, I can imagine that you can't make the other guys happy, you can't make these other guys very sad either. So how are they dealing with that?
Businesses already running below capacity, many 10% below the amount of power they need to be drawing. Now they say, oh, you can take another 10%. Wow, do we want to go growth in South Africa?
I'm a residential consumer of electricity, but shouldn't the residential consumer, Mike, be penalised, as it were, less electricity, if you know when it's going off, if you know it's 2 or 3 hours a day and you know when it is? Wouldn't that be better than shutting business down and expecting 10% or 20% cuts from which will affect economic growth?
I concur. It doesn't make an ounce of sense to me for businesses that are generating income and creating employment to actually have their cuts through there. But yet there's nothing about the households at any level in terms of the amount of electricity they can use. And the municipalities are not, in fact, they're reinforcing the problems that Eskom have got, because Eskom says they're going to be down for 2 hours. Well, certainly last week we were in our suburb, we were down for 4.5 hours. Yeah. The other 2.5 hours must be the municipality.
And you were lucky.
May I come in there? Because I think we've got to keep a level head about this. Only 5% of Eskom's generated electricity is supplied direct to Eskom domestic users. Another 5 to 10% is supplied to municipal users. On the other hand, something like 50% of all Eskom electricity is supplied to large industry. So I think you can see that that even if you were to rotational shed domestic users, split it into 5 groups, it's only going to make a fairly small contribution to the 20% that Eskom are looking for. The real juice, unfortunately, and I say that, comes from the industrial sector.
Chris, another issue, the chairman doesn't have a candidate list of potential people to now turn this big animal around. Who do you suggest should be taking?
Well, I've written on the subject and tongue-in-cheek suggested Trevor Manuel as a candidate. I think he would be a great candidate, but I don't think it's a realistic proposal on my side. Maybe done somewhat tongue-in-cheek.
Do you think that there is an unspoken, unwritten requirement that it is a black South African that has to run that and a South African that has to run it?
I don't think necessarily a black South African, but I do think it has to be somebody who operates at a high political level, because that person needs to operate peer-to-peer, shoulder-to-shoulder with the cabinet. And not on a level of junior to senior. I think we have to have somebody who can talk truth to power, and that's why Trevor Manuel was so appealing to me. Somebody who's been not only in the cabinet, but also the head of the National Planning Commission. He understands the economy, he understands government, he understands the bureaucracy of big organizations. He's got a grip on the whole planning of the South African economy. That's why
While Chris is still here, Ian and Mike, any suggestions? Brian Joffe, Mark Lamberti?
I don't know, but does it have to be a South African? Let's take the private sector. Let's look at Anglo-American, who seem to have a bit of a leadership, less than ideal leadership for some time. And then they got a foreigner in. An Australian is not too foreign to us, but nevertheless.
Canadian before that.
And he has helped to turn them around. So he didn't actually have to be one of that inner clique. He just knew how to handle them, and he knew the business. That's why I think we need primarily somebody who has run power stations, rickety ones like ours, elsewhere in the world, and know how to pull all these very faint bits of string together.
Give us a name, Mark.
Cyril Ramaphosa. But together with a technical team, I mean, we've got just about 10 gigawatts of capacity that's unplanned maintenance. Yeah. We need some serious technical expertise to get in and start fixing this quickly. Medupi's, I think the first unit is 800 megawatts.
Correct.
I mean, if we unplanned at 9.7 gigawatts and Medupi's coming in at 800 megawatts, it's not going to make much difference at all. We need a technical team to get in and start fixing this problem, because we're going to have a problem for a long time to come like this if we don't.
Chris, the effect on economic growth of these load sheddings. I saw Peter Attar-Nontolto from London, Namura. We talked to him on Friday. He said for every day of load shedding, 0.18% of GDP is going to be. Now, how they reach that precise number, I don't know. But it must have an effect.
Of course it has an effect. I'm not an economist, so I can't point to the impact on GDP or on inflation, but in the world of electrical engineering, there's a thing called the cost of unserved energy. In other words, what is the cost to the economy for every kilowatt hour of energy not delivered that the productive economy wanted? And Eskom used figures of something like 80 Rand per kilowatt hour for the cost of unserved energy, remembering the cost of electricity that Eskom is charging is about 1 Rand per kilowatt hour. So the impact on the economy is 80 times higher than the cost of that kilowatt hour of electricity.
Yet the Rand didn't respond, and that was the thing that puzzled Peter Attard-Montalto. He said he expected the Rand to have moved, but it didn't on Friday. Yeah?
It'll happen. I think perhaps we're slow reactors in this respect, and I think that that is going to have an impact. Perhaps South Africans wait to see the actual numbers. We may get some indications this week in the Reserve Bank's quarterly bulletin and the current account, the state of that. That's all going to be pointing to gradual slowing, especially looking ahead.
Mike, the economic effect? Rand effect?
I think the foreigners are coming into our bond market, so if it looks like the economy is going to slow down more than expected, the bond yields will probably actually go lower, so that will benefit them. That's probably why they're doing it. Again, I don't, the trade effect is confidence effect. That's a longer term thing. In the short term, it's the capital flows, and if these things are going to disrupt the economy and really put our forecasts in jeopardy, then there's a good chance that our bond yields will actually our yield curve will start to come down a bit, which if you have a relatively stable or strengthening Rand, the foreign bondholders would like that. It works both ways for them.
Chris, looking at the coal, let's just get back to the coal that you mentioned earlier. We are going to be reliant on coal. Pravin Gordhan in the budget speech deferred the carbon emissions taxes, saying we can't do everything here. Let's keep the lights on if we can. Wet coal, should we be sympathetic about this? It reminds me of that dispute in Britain some years ago about the wrong kind of wet leaves on the rails, which meant the trains couldn't run. Is there any other way with our coal?
Look, the question of wet coal is not the cause of our problems. It rains every summer, sometimes harder than others. One has to deal, these are normal operating conditions, the same as hot weather, the same as cold weather. A well-organized utility deals with these things as everyday normal occurrences. The problem is much deeper, structural, but yes, I do think we have an overdependence on coal. I mean, some rain and the whole country goes into load shedding. This is an overdependence on coal, for sure.
Well, it's not as bad as it was in January 2008, when the whole thing was a shock, and I remember the whole of Johannesburg came to a standstill. Let's hope we never get to that again. Thanks to Chris Yelland, MD of EE Publishers, Ian Cruikshanks, Chief Economist at the SA Institute of Race Relations, and Mike Howarth, MD of Applied Capital Insights.